Picture this. You're standing in the Montana Territory in October of 1882, and you can feel winter breathing down your neck like some kind of predator. The air has that sharp bite that tells you snow is coming, whether you're ready or not. And for Sarah McKenney, watching her 3 children huddle together in their canvas tent while the first flakes begin to fall, ready is the last thing she is. Her husband died just 2 months ago. 2 months. Think about that for a second. In our modern world, 2 months might be enough time to file insurance claims, maybe start looking at new housing options. But in 1882, Montana Territory, 2 months meant Sarah was staring at half-built cabin walls and a winter that would kill her family if she couldn't figure something out fast. Now, I want you to understand something about frontier construction in this era. This wasn't like calling up a contractor and having them swing by next Tuesday. The traditional building methods of the time demanded 8 to 10 men working together for 6 to 8 weeks. 6 to 8 weeks, and these weren't just any men. They had to know what they were doing, had to have the tools, had to be available when you needed them. Sarah McKenney had none of these things. Across the entire frontier that winter, 400 people would die from exposure. 400 human beings, frozen to death in tents and half-built shelters while they waited for construction crews that charged $300, more money than most families saw in half a year, and arrived too late if they arrived at all. But here's where our story gets interesting, because into this landscape of desperation and death rode a man who would change everything. His name was Jake Morrison, though most folks called him Timber Jack, and he was carrying something more valuable than gold in his head. Knowledge. Revolutionary knowledge that he'd learned from Swedish immigrants up in the Minnesota logging camps. For 3 years, Morrison had lived among the Lindqvist family. 3 years of brutal Minnesota winters, watching these Nordic immigrants build structures that laughed at cold that would kill other folks. The Lindqvists had brought with them centuries of building wisdom, techniques developed in a land where winter wasn't just harsh, it was a 6-month death sentence if you didn't know what you were doing. The key, Morrison discovered, lay in their distinctive notching system. Now, this is where it gets fascinating from an engineering perspective. Traditional American log construction relied on what we call saddle notching. You'd cut a rounded groove in one log to sit on top of another. It worked, but it required perfect fits, extensive chinking with mud or moss to fill gaps, and lots of manpower to wrestle heavy logs into position. But the Swedish method, they used diagonal cuts that locked logs together like puzzle pieces. Think about that image for a moment. Instead of just stacking logs and hoping they'd stay put, these cuts created mechanical joints that pulled themselves tight. The logs actually wanted to stay together. And here's the beautiful part. This eliminated most of the chinking work and reduced construction time so dramatically that it seemed almost like magic to anyone watching. The established builders in Montana Territory didn't much like magic, especially when it threatened their profits. Thomas Hartwell and his Montana Construction Company had the frontier building trade locked up tighter than a drum. They controlled prices, they controlled timelines, and they liked it that way. It was a medieval monopoly dressed up in frontier clothes, and desperate settlers had exactly 0 choices if they wanted shelter before winter killed them. When Morrison first demonstrated his technique to Sarah McKenney, something extraordinary happened. With just her teenage son helping her teenage son, he completed her cabin walls in 4 days. 4 days to do work that traditionally took teams of men weeks to accomplish. Word of this achievement spread through Copper Creek like wildfire in dry grass. But here's what makes this story so compelling from a historical perspective. This wasn't just about building techniques. This was about power, about who controlled access to basic survival on the frontier. Thomas Hartwell didn't see Morrison as a fellow builder or even as competition. He saw him as an existential threat to everything his company represented. Think about it from Hartwell's perspective for a moment. You've built an entire business model around scarcity, scarce labor, scarce expertise, scarce time. People pay your prices because they have to, because winter doesn't negotiate. And suddenly here comes this quiet cowboy with knowledge that makes your entire operation look obsolete. The frontier was a place where innovation could literally mean the difference between life and death, but it was also a place where established interests fought dirty to maintain their advantages. As word of Morrison's method spread from cabin to cabin, from settlement to settlement, Thomas Hartwell began planning Jake Morrison's downfall. And that's where our story takes a turn that would determine not just the fate of one man or one technique, but the entire pattern of Western settlement for generations to come. Because what happened next would pit old ways against new, monopoly against innovation, and one man's knowledge against an entire system designed to keep that knowledge scarce and expensive. The question hanging in the air as that first winter snow began to fall wasn't just whether Sarah McKenney's children would survive the cold. It was whether one cowboy's revolutionary building technique could survive the much more dangerous forces of human greed and territorial power. And the answer to that question would be decided in a confrontation that nobody saw coming. Thomas Hartwell wasn't the kind of man who waited around for problems to solve themselves. When word reached him that some cowboy was undermining his entire business model one cabin at a time, he did what powerful men have always done when threatened. He used the system against his enemy. The charges were fabricated, of course. Building without proper permits in a territory where permits were whatever Thomas Hartwell said they were. Morrison found himself arrested on a cold November morning, dragged before Judge Samuel Crawford in what passed for a courthouse in Billings. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn, because Crawford was nobody's fool. Samuel Crawford had been dispensing frontier justice for 15 years, and he could smell a setup from 3 counties away. He looked at the charges, looked at Hartwell sitting in the back of his makeshift courtroom with a satisfied smirk, and then looked at Jake Morrison standing there in his work clothes, still covered in sawdust from building someone's winter shelter. Now, Crawford could have just dismissed the charges and sent everyone home, but he was also a student of human nature, and he understood something important about frontier communities. People needed to see justice done, needed to witness truth being separated from lies in a way that left no doubt in anyone's mind. So Judge Crawford proposed something that would go down in territorial history as either brilliant or completely insane, depending on who you asked. The Billings Construction Challenge of 1883. 2 teams, 2 identical cabin specifications, winner takes all. If Morrison lost, he would leave Montana Territory forever and never return. If he won, Thomas Hartwell would publicly acknowledge the superiority of Morrison's method and cease all interference with its practice. The announcement drew hundreds of spectators from across the territory. Think about that for a moment. In our modern world, we might tune in to watch skilled craftsmen compete on television. But in 1883 Montana, this was the live event of the decade. People traveled for days just to witness what everyone understood would be more than a building contest. 2-8 cold. It would be a trial of old ways against new, tradition against innovation. Among those spectators was Elizabeth Thorne, a reporter for the Helena Daily Herald, and one of the few women working in frontier journalism. Thorne understood immediately that she was witnessing history in the making, and she documented every detail with the precision of someone who knew she was recording something that would matter long after the last nail was driven. The challenge began at dawn on a crisp March morning. Morrison worked alone, just as he preferred, while Hartwell assembled a crew of 6 experienced builders, men who had been constructing cabins since before Morrison ever heard of diagonal notching. The contrast was striking from the very first hour. Hartwell's team attacked their foundation with the methodical precision of traditional construction. They measured twice, cut once, fitted each log with careful attention to detail. It was solid work, the kind that had built thousands of frontier structures, but it was also slow work, requiring constant communication between crew members, frequent adjustments, and the kind of heavy lifting that wore men down as the day progressed. Morrison, meanwhile, seemed to dance with his materials. His diagonal cuts flowed together with mathematical precision, each log sliding into position as if it belonged nowhere else. While Hartwell's crew struggled with corner notching, measuring and remeasuring to achieve proper fits, Morrison's pieces locked together like they had been designed by nature herself. The crowd began to murmur by the end of the first day. Morrison had completed his foundation and was well into his first course of walls, while Hartwell's team was still wrestling with foundation logs that seemed determined not to cooperate. But Thomas Hartwell hadn't built his empire by accepting defeat gracefully. On the second night, with Morrison's cabin taking shape faster than anyone thought possible, Hartwell's desperation drove him to something that would haunt his reputation for the rest of his life. Under cover of darkness, his men crept to Morrison's construction site and began weakening his foundation logs, cutting partially through key supports in places where the damage wouldn't be immediately visible. But they hadn't counted on Marcus Lindqvist. The old Swede had travelled all the way from Minnesota to witness his former student's moment of triumph. At 68 years old, Marcus still possessed the instincts of a man who had survived decades of harsh winters by paying attention to details that could kill you if ignored. He was making his evening rounds of the construction site when he heard the soft sound of steel biting into wood where no construction should have been happening. The confrontation that followed nearly turned violent. 6 men with saws and crowbars facing down one elderly immigrant who spoke English with an accent thick as pine sap. But Marcus Lindqvist had something more dangerous than weapons. He had a voice loud enough to wake half of Billings, and he used it to call for Judge Crawford at the top of his lungs. What happened next depends on who tells the story, but everyone agrees that Crawford arrived within minutes, still in his nightclothes but carrying a shotgun that looked like it had seen considerable use. The judge took one look at the sabotaged foundation logs, one look at Hartwell's men standing there with tools in their hands, and delivered a piece of frontier justice that became legendary. Crawford gave Hartwell a choice. His men could spend the night repairing every bit of damage they had caused, working under armed guard to restore Morrison's foundation to its original condition, or they could all spend the next 6 months in territorial prison for destruction of property and interference with legal proceedings. Hartwell chose the repairs. As dawn broke on day 4, something extraordinary was happening in Billings. Morrison placed his final roof beam, while Hartwell's team was still struggling with walls that refused to cooperate. The crowd that had gathered to watch a building contest found themselves witnessing something much more significant, the public demonstration that one man's innovation could triumph over an entire system designed to keep that innovation suppressed. When Elizabeth Thorne's subsequent article, "The Miracle of the Morrison Method," appeared in the Helena Daily Herald, it spread across 7 territories within weeks. But more importantly, it carried with it detailed descriptions of Morrison's techniques, turning one newspaper article into what we might recognize today as the first mass-distributed technical manual for revolutionary construction methods. The challenge was over, but the real transformation was just beginning. What happened next might be the most remarkable example of rapid technological adoption in American frontier history. Elizabeth Thorne's article didn't just spread the story of Morrison's victory. It carried detailed technical descriptions that turned newspaper readers into builders overnight. Within 6 months, Morrison's diagonal notching technique was being tested from Nebraska to Wyoming, and the results were nothing short of revolutionary. In Nebraska, the Garrett family read Thorne's article in their sod house during a brutal February blizzard. When spring arrived, they used Morrison's method to build their timber homestead in 5 days. 5 days to go from foundation to finished walls, a timeline that would have been considered impossible just 1 year earlier. But here's what makes their story even more remarkable. They did it with just family labor. No hired crews, no specialized craftsmen, just farmers who had never built anything more complex than a chicken coop. The technique seemed to unlock something in frontier communities that had been waiting for exactly this kind of innovation. In Wyoming, entire settlements began organizing what they called Morrison parties, combining his efficient building methods with the traditional barn-raising spirit of cooperation that had always characterized frontier life. These weren't just construction projects. They were social events that brought communities together around the shared goal of ensuring everyone had proper shelter before winter arrived. But perhaps the most significant change was who could now participate in construction. Traditional log building required serious upper body strength and years of experience to handle heavy timbers and complex joinery. Morrison's method, with its precise cuts and mechanical joints, was different. The pieces were lighter, the assembly more intuitive, the margin for error much more forgiving. Women and children, previously relegated to cooking for construction crews and staying out of the way, found themselves actively participating in building their own homes. Mary Chen, a Chinese immigrant in Dakota Territory, became something of a legend when she built her entire cabin alone in 7 days, completely alone. No hired help, no family assistance, just one woman with Morrison's technique and the determination to prove it could be done. Think about what that meant in 1884. A single woman, an immigrant, building her own home faster than established construction crews could complete theirs. Mary Chen's achievement challenged every assumption about who could build and how building got done. Her cabin became a pilgrimage site of sorts, with families traveling hundreds of miles just to see proof that the impossible had become routine. By the winter of 1884, over 3,000 cabins stood across the frontier using Morrison's method. 3,000 families, who might otherwise have spent another winter in tents or sod houses, or crowded into someone else's shelter. The demographic impact was staggering. Entire regions that had been considered too remote for permanent settlement suddenly found themselves hosting thriving communities. The Great Blizzard of January 1885 provided the ultimate test of Morrison's innovation. This was the kind of weather event that, in previous years, would have killed hundreds of frontier settlers. Temperatures dropped to 40 below zero and stayed there for weeks. Snow piled 15 feet deep in some areas. Traditional shelters, hastily built or poorly maintained, became death traps as chinking failed and heat escaped through poorly fitted joints. But the cabins built with Morrison's method held firm. The diagonal notching that locked logs together mechanically meant no gaps for wind to exploit, no loose joints to fail under the stress of expansion and contraction. When the spring thaw finally arrived and survivors began taking stock, the numbers told an incredible story. Only 17 people died from exposure during the entire blizzard, and none of them were in properly built Morrison method cabins. Morrison himself nearly became a casualty, but not from weather. The demand for his knowledge had him traveling constantly across the frontier, teaching his technique to anyone who would listen. In Wyoming, he spent 2 weeks with a Shoshone community, adapting his methods to work with local timber varieties. In Colorado, he worked with Mexican settlers to modify the technique for adobe and log combination construction. The pace was killing him. By winter of 1884, Jake Morrison was a walking skeleton, running on coffee and determination, barely sleeping as he moved from settlement to settlement. In Cheyenne, while demonstrating advanced roofing methods to a crowd of local builders, he simply collapsed. One moment he was explaining how to cut roof beam notches. The next he was unconscious in the snow. Dr. James Mitchell, a former army surgeon who had settled in Cheyenne after the Indian Wars, took Morrison into his home for 3 weeks of forced recovery. Mitchell's journals, discovered decades later, provide fascinating insight into Morrison's state of mind during this period. The cowboy who had revolutionized frontier construction was consumed by a sense of urgency that bordered on obsession. Morrison told Mitchell he could feel winter bearing down on families across the territory who still lacked proper shelter. Every day he spent recovering was another day that someone might freeze to death for lack of knowledge he could have shared. It was Mitchell who finally convinced Morrison that he needed to train others to teach his methods, that one man couldn't personally save every family on the frontier. The economic transformation happening alongside these social changes was equally dramatic. Lumber mills from Minnesota to Oregon began adapting their cutting patterns to accommodate Morrison's specifications. The diagonal cuts required more precision than traditional sawing, but they also used wood more efficiently and created stronger joints. Mill owners discovered they could charge premium prices for Morrison-cut lumber while actually reducing waste. Blacksmiths found themselves in unprecedented demand for specialized tools. José Reyes in Santa Fe developed a curved chisel specifically designed for Morrison's diagonal cuts, and within months he was shipping tools across the entire southwestern frontier. The ripple effects touched every aspect of the frontier economy, from transportation companies moving specialized lumber to hardware stores stocking new types of construction tools. But perhaps the most surprising economic development was the collapse of Thomas Hartwell's resistance to Morrison's methods. The Montana Construction Company, facing bankruptcy as customers abandoned traditional building for faster, cheaper alternatives, found itself in the humiliating position of needing to learn from the man Hartwell had tried to destroy. The scene of Thomas Hartwell approaching Morrison's sickbed in Dr. Mitchell's house became one of those moments that defined an era. Here was the established construction monopolist, hat in hand, asking his former enemy to teach him the very methods he had tried to suppress. Morrison's response revealed the character that had driven his entire crusade. He agreed immediately, but with one non-negotiable condition. The technique must be taught freely to anyone who asked. No patents, no licensing fees, no restrictions on who could learn or use Morrison's methods. Knowledge that could save lives, Morrison insisted, belonged to everyone who needed it. The handshake between Morrison and Hartwell marked the end of construction monopolies on the frontier and the beginning of something unprecedented, an open-source revolution in frontier building technology. By 1890, the transformation was complete. Morrison's technique had enabled the rapid settlement of the last frontier territories, changing not just how people built their homes, but who could build them and where they could be built. The frontier had become a place where innovation traveled faster than winter, and where one man's knowledge, freely shared, had literally reshaped a continent. By 1890, the numbers told a story that would have seemed impossible just 8 years earlier. The frontier territories were experiencing population increases of 300% in areas previously considered too remote for winter settlement. 300%. To put that in perspective, regions that had counted their inhabitants in the dozens were now hosting communities of hundreds or thousands. This wasn't just demographic change, double O. It was political transformation. The rapid settlement enabled by Morrison's building methods meant that territories could achieve the population thresholds required for statehood faster than anyone had anticipated. Montana achieved statehood in 1889, Wyoming in 1890, largely due to population growth that would have been impossible without accessible, efficient construction methods. Think about what that meant for American political development. The balance of power in Congress, the electoral dynamics of presidential elections, the very shape of American democracy, was being influenced by one cowboy's innovation in log notching. It's one of those historical examples that reminds us how technological change and political change are often more intertwined than we realize. Morrison himself seemed to understand the broader implications of what he had unleashed. In 1890, he established the Free Building Institute in Billings, Montana. This wasn't just a school, it was a revolutionary concept in technical education. Anyone could come, anyone could learn, and nobody paid a cent for instruction that could literally save their life. The institute's first female instructor was Sarah McKenney, the widow whose desperate situation had first motivated Morrison to share his techniques publicly. Sarah had become something of a legend herself, not just as the woman whose crisis started everything, but as someone who had mastered Morrison's methods well enough to teach them to others. Her classes attracted students from across the continent, including veterans of the Indian Wars, who found that Morrison's efficient methods allowed them to build homes despite missing limbs or suffering other injuries that made traditional construction impossible. The international spread of Morrison's techniques reveals something fascinating about how innovation travels. Canadian provinces adopted the method for their western expansion, with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police commissioning detailed manuals for frontier construction using Morrison's diagonal notching. Russian settlers in Alaska employed the technique to build structures that could withstand Arctic conditions that made Montana winters look mild by comparison. But perhaps the most remarkable students of Morrison's methods were the Native American communities who had been displaced by Western expansion. Tribes forced onto reservations found in Morrison's techniques a way to quickly construct permanent buildings that met government requirements while using traditional materials and incorporating elements of their own architectural knowledge. The Lakota, in particular, adapted Morrison's notching system to create structures that combined log construction with traditional teepee engineering principles. Morrison's personal life during these years reflects the quiet satisfaction of a man who had accomplished something far beyond his original intentions. His romance with Elizabeth Thorne, the reporter who had documented his first victory, developed slowly through years of correspondence as she covered the spread of his building methods across the frontier. When they finally married in 1892, they chose to build their home together using his techniques, completing it in exactly 3 days as a kind of wedding celebration. Their marriage represented something symbolically important about the changing frontier. Here was a cowboy who had become a teacher and an innovator, married to a woman who had carved out a career in journalism at a time when such opportunities barely existed for women. Together, they embodied the kind of social mobility and personal reinvention that Morrison's techniques had made possible for thousands of families. The couple never had children, but they became mentors to dozens of young builders who came to study at the Free Building Institute. Morrison's teaching style was reportedly gentle but exacting. He insisted that students understand not just how to make the diagonal cuts, but why they worked. He wanted people to be able to adapt his methods to local conditions, local materials, and local needs rather than simply copying techniques by rote. The final test of Morrison's legacy came in 1906, when the San Francisco earthquake created massive housing needs virtually overnight. Morrison, now 64 and supposedly retired, traveled west one last time to teach rapid construction techniques to rebuilding crews working to shelter earthquake refugees. Witnesses described him working 16-hour days, demonstrating his methods to crews of carpenters who had never built with logs but needed to learn fast. The San Francisco project revealed how far Morrison's influence had spread beyond frontier log construction. Urban builders adapted his principles of mechanical joinery and efficient assembly to frame construction, creating hybrid techniques that combined frontier innovation with city-building needs. Some of the earthquake relief housing built using Morrison-inspired methods was still standing and occupied 50 years later, a testament to the structural soundness of his approach. Morrison died peacefully in December 1912, surrounded by 3 generations of builders he had trained. His funeral drew thousands of people, many traveling hundreds of miles to pay respects to the man who had literally shaped their communities. Each mourner carried a small wooden token carved with Morrison's distinctive diagonal notch, NTAF, a symbol that had become synonymous with innovation shared freely rather than hoarded for profit. Elizabeth Thorne Morrison lived until 1934, spending her later years documenting the stories of families whose lives had been changed by her husband's techniques. Her archives, preserved at the Montana Historical Society, contain over 2,000 letters from builders, homesteaders, and community leaders describing how Morrison's methods had influenced their lives and communities. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to Morrison's legacy is found in something he never could have anticipated. In the 1930s, when the Civilian Conservation Corps began building structures in national parks across the American West, they used construction techniques derived directly from Morrison's innovations. The rustic lodges and visitor centers that still welcome millions of tourists each year were built using principles that trace back to a Swedish notching system learned by a cowboy in a Minnesota logging camp. Today, if you know what to look for, you can still find Morrison's influence in log homes from Alaska to Arizona. Modern builders have refined his techniques with power tools and engineered lumber, but the fundamental principle remains unchanged: diagonal cuts that lock logs together mechanically, creating structures that are stronger, faster to build, and more efficient than traditional methods. Jake Morrison never sought fame or fortune from his innovation. He never filed patents or tried to control how his techniques were used. Instead, he chose to share knowledge that he believed belonged to anyone who needed shelter, and in doing so, he created something far more valuable than any monopoly could have provided. He created a legacy that continues to shelter families more than a century after his death, proof that some innovations are too important to be owned by any one person or company. In the end, Morrison's story reminds us that the most profound changes often come not from grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but from quiet individuals who see a better way and have the courage to share it with anyone willing to learn. His legacy lives on, not in monuments or museums, but in the thousands of homes across North America, where families still gather safely through winter storms, protected by walls that lock together like puzzle pieces, just as Jake Morrison learned from the Lindqvist family in a Minnesota logging camp more than a century ago.